It's time for the Phil Ferguson Show.
Buongiorno tutti. This is Phil Ferguson, and you are listening to the cleverly titled The Phil Ferguson Show. It is March of 2019, and just a little heads up, I do have some travel plans in the next few weeks. I'm not sure when the next show will come out. Might be next week. I'm kind of thinking it's just not going to happen. Might be 2 weeks. It's 50-50. It might even be 3 weeks. So if you love this show and you love getting it about every week, I am so sorry. I am so sorry that I will not likely be able to have time to do the shows for a week or two. This is one of the reasons why the Patreon page is set up where people donate per show instead of monthly, because it might happen that for a few weeks I just cannot get a show out because I'm taking some time off, or at least off-ish, because I still answer emails and phone calls from clients even when I'm on the road. I might take a couple of days that I don't answer, but usually you can't ignore all your clients for weeks on end. You start pissing people off. So I won't be doing that, but I might skip a few weeks of the show. So be advised about that. Later today, we are going to talk with Monica Miller about a ginormous 40-foot ugly-ass concrete cross on government land, and she actually got to go in front of the Supreme Court and argue that it should be moved, removed, changed, something. It's got to go away. The government cannot sponsor Christianity or a specific set of Christianity over other religions or non-religion. That's just the way we roll in America. At least that's the way we should roll. So we're going to be talking about that. And the formal investing skeptically segment in a few minutes will be about the cushion and what you might want to own, some ideas on what you could own. Bond funds, the safe stuff, the really boring part of your portfolio. It's not cool to make 3% in a year unless you get a year where the stock market loses 30% and then something in your portfolio making positive 3% looks absolutely brilliant. A couple of other quick housekeeping things. We are raising money for American Atheist Conference. That is going to be based on people who donate at Patreon. It's all the revenue in January, February, and March. It doesn't look like it's going to bump up against our maximums at all, which is fine. That's cool. But my anonymous donor has already agreed to send $2,500, which was his limit, and I'm going to double his amount. Well, I already did double his amount and send the money to American Atheists so that they have the money in advance and can start scheduling with students to show up. So because of the listeners and an anonymous donor, we have collectively raised over $7,500 for American Atheists to offset travel costs and issue travel grants for students to save money to go to American Atheist conferences, because hopefully these students, whether they're high school, junior high, college, whatever, will be in this fight, sadly, much longer than me and much longer than many of our listeners, but we need to make sure we are providing for that legacy. A couple other quick things. Show listener had a neat idea about selling certain index funds and then buying other index funds by paying attention to when the dividend dates are. So you could get the dividends from one fund, sell it, and then get dividends from another fund, and sell it, and get dividends from another fund. Very clever idea. They just happen to not know the fact that when the dividend is declared, so for example, if a mutual fund declares on December 10th that they're going to pay a dividend, that dividend may not be paid until December 18th. But there's a declaration date. And on that declaration date, usually that's that date, but When they declare it, everyone knows that that money is coming out of the fund price drops. So if you look at a mutual fund price, you might see 10, 10, 10, 10, 10, and all of a sudden it goes to $9.80. And you go, well, what happened on that day where my bond fund went down 2%? Well, that was the day it declared that they're going to pay a dividend to everyone that owns that fund as of that date. It might take them a week or 10 days to get the money out to everybody or to actually pay the dividend into your account. So if you sell the fund right after the dividend came out, it's going to be at a lower price. There's no way to kind of cheat the system and make the dividends from half a dozen different funds in a short period of time. So nice try. I like this outside the box thinking. It just won't work. Let's see here. What else do I have on? Vanguard is getting rid of a lot of the investor class shares of funds. These were a lot of the funds that had $3,000 minimums to get in. And if you had more money, usually $10,000 and sometimes in some cases $50,000, you could get into the Admiral share funds, which had slightly lower expense ratios. We're talking about really small little differences here, but they've decided to move everybody into the Admiral shares, and they're closing the individual shares. So if you look at Vanguard, you might see this fund is closed, or if you pull up some data somewhere, this fund is closed. If you already own one of those funds, you're going to get a free upgrade. Woo! It's like getting first class on your airplane. At some point during this calendar year, 2019, Vanguard intends to move everyone in the funds that they are doing this for, because it doesn't apply to every single fund, but lots and lots of funds, something like 50 funds. If you're in the investor share, you will automatically get moved at some point to the Admiral share, and your expense ratio will go down slightly. And it's all free to you, and it will all happen behind the scenes. You don't need to do anything. If you see that your fund is closed to new investors, don't panic. It's all going to be good. I also have an email. I just pulled out some text from the email because it ties in nicely, and it's one of the drivers for some of the content in the Investing Skeptically segment here. Phil, we spoke a few years ago. I had questions about my account. I don't want to give too much money here, or too much information. I'm still listening to the show, still loving it, been very helpful for me. And I also wanted to let you know it has allowed us to help my mother. Unfortunately, our dad made poor choices with investing. He used Edward Jones. I'm so sorry to hear that. She has an inherited IRA, and we are now moving everything into some of the things that you've suggested on your show at Vanguard. Further goes on, says, I love the show where you talked about stocks. Specifically, I was talking about stock index funds and the Morningstar style box or the tic-tac-toe grid to give people a better visualization if you've not seen it somewhere. Do you have something that goes over, and he called it the buffer. I recently used the word buffer, talking about index funds with buffers, but what he means is the cushion. So can you talk about the cushion and what's in it and kind of how that breaks down, kind of like you broke down stocks in the tic-tac-toe thing? And so the Investing Skeptically segment, I'm going to go over all the bond funds that I currently use and some of the bond funds I currently do not use, but used years ago and will very likely use again in the future when interest rates are better. So you'll learn all about that in the Investing Skeptically segment, the difference between short-term, intermediate, long-term, domestic, international, emerging markets, Jenny Mays, all those different bond funds. I give you all the call letters. If it goes by too fast, replay it or send me an email, phil@polarisfinancialplanning.com. And once again, for a couple of weeks, I might not make a show. Again, I apologize. Patrons, yeah, on Patreon, if you're a patron, you won't pay if there's no show. That's why I set it up by week. If I have enough time to make a best of Phil Ferguson show where I dig up an old interview, that will also be flagged as non-charging, non-paying. So if you're a patron and you contribute to the show, if I do a best of episode to fill a gap, because I can't do a whole new show for a couple of weeks, you will not be charged for that. Again, that's why I set up the Patreon account to be by show. So if I skip a few weeks, you're not out any money. if I put up a best of show that might have 10 or 15, 20 minutes of new content, but then an interview from someone from the Wayback Machine in the archives, because we're almost to show 300. I wish I had something magically planned special to do for the show, but that's like real work. I'm just running out of time. So we're going to take a quick break. We're going to do Investing Skeptically. We're going to have a talk with Monica Miller about being at the Supreme Court and how she and American Humanists, as well as other organizations, are protecting non-believer rights and actually the rights of everyone in the United States to be equally represented. So sit tight. Don't go anywhere. You're going to really, really, really enjoy the show. Today's Investing Skeptically segment is all about the cushion. And so if you're new to the show, this is going to not make a whole lot of sense to you necessarily, but regular listeners know this is the part of the portfolio that you start to build, and you want to have it be big enough when you get to retirement, close to retirement, or in retirement. And even though I can always easily calculate what percentage of your portfolio is in the cushion, that is not the driver for the size of the cushion. I'm not going to go into that in elaborate detail today, but basically it's to say that, so if you're 30, have all your money in stocks. If you're 40, have all your money in stocks. When you get to 12 years from retirement, maybe 14, 15 years from retirement, you want to start thinking about having some money in bonds. And, even if you're 20 years from retirement and if you want to have 5 or 7 or 10% in bonds, it's not going to kill you. And if you get a market dip, you could always put it back in the stocks. But the best way to make the most money in the long run is stocks. So if you're not close to or in retirement, you don't want a whole lot in the cushion. But if you get closer to retirement, you want to start building the cushion. And I often give very, very general guidelines, and I'm kind of encouraged to be conservative when I'm presenting information generally like this, really, really generally, because if someone is investing too aggressively and it doesn't work out, they can be hurt and or upset with me, which I don't want either case. So if I'm pushed to say what percentage one should have in a cushion at retirement, 30 to 50%, and that's a pretty big swing. If you really have no idea what you're doing, 40 to 50%. Although you can have cases where my dad, when he passed away at the age of 81, had 10% in a cushion, 10% in bonds, and still had 90% in stock. Now, that was appropriate for him and could be appropriate for you if you don't really need the money, or if you're taking 2 or 3% out of your portfolio, not 5 or more. So maybe more on that later if people are really interested. You let me know what you want me to talk about. Send me emails. I get them all the time. That's one of the drivers for going over this. It's been a while since I've done this in detail, so I wanted to spend some time going over what's in the cushion. So we are going to assume that someone has a $1 million portfolio because it's just a nice round number. And they happen to have 40% in the cushion. And again, it's not because 40% is the right number. It just worked out that that is the amount of cushion that was necessary to protect them. So if you have multiple incomes or one person's working and one person's not, you can have a smaller cushion. If you can dramatically cut your spending for a year or two and you don't need the protection of the cushion, you can have a smaller cushion. If you have a larger percentage of your retirement money coming from pensions, Social Security, rental properties, some other sources, and the portfolio is not that important to you, you can have a smaller cushion. If you need 5% out of the portfolio, or because usually 5% is the limit. If you're retiring at like 50 or 55, I might even say 4% for a few years just to make sure. But if you're retiring at 67, you might even go to 6% out of the portfolio. If you're retiring 75, maybe 7% per year out of the portfolio. And so you want to have a larger and larger portion of your money in the cushion to make sure nothing weird happens in the remaining years that you're going to need it. Also, if you don't need your portfolio at all, and you intend to leave it to your kids or nieces and nephews, whatever it is you want to do, a charity, you could still have it all in stocks if you don't need the money at all. So everybody's position is different. And so what drives the size of the cushion is different. Also, I've had a few requests for, and I might go over this again in the near future. Again, let me know if this is something specific to you about what to sell and when. I mean, in a given year, do you sell stocks? Do you sell bonds? How do you get money out of your portfolio? And every once in a while, someone will ask me, can't you just do one show where you cover everything about your system? Apparently not. Apparently not, because I'm giving these little side pieces that aren't directly related to what I'm going to go over today. There's a lot of stuff going on. It's all in the show. I've covered it all, and I'll cover it all again. But it's complicated. And you can do it all on your own. But if you don't, in part, this show is a shamelessly self-promotional plug for me, Phil Ferguson, and my business, Polaris Financial Planning. And if you meet the minimum of $500,000 and want to consider hiring me, of course, you're welcome to do so. You don't have to. The information here is still free. You can send me an email, phil@polarisfinancialplanning.com. So let's just get into some of these funds. So we're going to assume, like I said, $1 million portfolio, $400,000 in the cushion, and you are just about to retire. I mean, we're talking weeks, months away. So the first thing at TD Ameritrade, where I have my accounts, we're going to have some money in cash, in money market, basically like a checking or savings account that you might have in your local town. If for whatever reason you want to keep a big chunk of money locally, $50,000, $100,000, you don't have to have a whole lot of money in the cash account at TD Ameritrade. But people often ask me, and I often have that to be between, 6 months to 18 months of what you're going to need. And again, this person has $1 million. The total they're going to need from the account is 5%, or about $50,000 per year. I'm going to round that to $4,000 per month, or about $48,000, just to make it easy. So you would set up your investment portfolio to send to your bank account $4,000 a month. So if you're getting $4,000 a month, 6 months worth would be $24,000. 18 months would be $72,000 out of your $1 million. So it can be a reasonable chunk, but the nice thing about that is the safest of safe investments. And right now it's going to make you 1.5% interest. It's not going to make you much. But if everything goes down for a year, you have the cash, right? You don't have to worry. It takes a lot of the concern away, because the ultimate purpose of money is to provide you with comfort, not necessarily to provide you with more money. That's nice. And when you're 30, you really want it to provide you more money. So at a later time, it can provide you that comfort. But we're talking about somebody in retirement. So you've got that cushiony stuff. The most conservative part is the cash, is the money market. And like I said, for someone with $1 million, maybe it's $24,000, maybe it's $72,000, somewhere in between. And what I often do for clients, and you can do this on your own, but now it requires you to be working, is that you set some kind of max and minimum. So maybe I could say minimum of $30,000, maximum of $50,000 for this particular person after discussions and consultations with their needs. And I review the portfolio every month. And if they get below $30,000 in cash, I might have to sell something. If they get too much in cash, I might want to buy something. So the cash is the easiest part, the safest part. These are going to go in order from the most safest. Is that even word? Most safest? Most safe? Safest to most aggressive types of bonds. And only bonds today is what we're going to talk about. Now, the very next thing, and I'm going to give call letters. I know this is dicey, and some people find it hard to follow along. You don't have to know these symbols. But if you want to look at funds that I actually use, I'm giving them to you. So the next one is VBIRX. VBIRX. And if any of this does not come clear through the podcast, send me an email. And that is the Vanguard Short-Term Government Bond Fund. Short-term U.S. government bonds, really safe, really conservative, but the yield has gone up quite a bit. You can make 2.6, 2.8% on those currently. A number I pulled today was 2.68. I'm not going to worry about it precisely as of today because it does fluctuate over time. But historically, this might be closer to 4%. But right now, let's call it 2.6, 2.8. This is what you're going to make per year on that fund. It might make 4%, or like the last couple of years, it might make 1 or 2%, because all of these bond funds have been doing poorly over the last couple of years because interest rates have been trending up. I've previously done segments on this more in detail, so I'm going to just kind of skim over it today. When interest rates go up, bonds get hurt. When interest rates go down, bonds go up. And so not only do you make the yield, but you can have appreciation in the value of the bonds or the bond fund or the bond index fund. We're not going to get too into that either today. So it's the Vanguard Short-Term Government Bond, VBIRX. Also short-term is the Short-Term Corporate Bond Fund, VFSUX. Very similar to the bond fund, except for it buys bonds from companies. And right now you can make 3.1 to 3.2. So it pays a little bit more yield. There is a slightly higher risk that some of those bonds will default. Most often they would just not pay the dividend. The company might go bankrupt and you lose a portion to half to all of your money in a couple individual bonds, but they buy a lot of bonds. And the risk of that is pretty small because that fund from Vanguard happens to buy very conservative corporate bonds. So it's not going to make a lot of yield. And this is one of the things that people will send me portfolios where they have short-term corporate bond fund that pays 7% yield. And you always have to ask yourself, how is it making 7% when really conservatives are making 3%? The only way they can get more yield is to take more risk. That might be what you choose to do, but you might not know that's what you're doing, because for me, primarily, the cushion is there for the purpose of protecting you when the stock market goes down. And if the stock market goes down and you have risky stocks and they go down at the same time, you now just failed to provide the protection for yourself that you were trying to do. As far as how much of your portfolio these two short-term bond funds could be, it depends, but these are going to kind of be the biggest chunks of your cushion right now. And the funds that I actually use change over time because of market conditions. So I like to think of it as that I'm not doing market timing, which means daily, weekly, monthly adjustments, jumping in and out. I don't do any of that. But I'm not completely ignorant about how bonds and bond markets work. So sometimes we make adjustments, but we're not doing any timing. So the first one, the short-term government, maybe 20, 25, 30% of your bond portfolio, and the short-term corporate about the same, maybe a little higher, maybe 25, 30, 35%. So these two together could be 45, 50, 55% of your portfolio. I mean, it's the heart of your portfolio, and your yield is going to be about 3%. It's not impressive. It's 3%, but you want it to be there for you. Next couple funds are intermediate term funds. So short term is usually 5 years or less to maturity. Intermediate is generally considered 5 to 10 years to maturity. Some people say 7 to 12, whatever. Yeah, you get the idea. There's no hard written rule or law that you have to follow on any of these fund naming, by the way. But the intermediate government bond fund from Vanguard, VSIGX, and the intermediate corporate fund, VICSX. God, so many freaking letters. I'm getting old. My eyes can't see that well. Those are intermediate funds. I currently do not use them. Their yields are about 2.5%, and for the government one, which actually is less than the short-term bond. And that's generally not seen as a good thing. But it wasn't that way 3 months ago. So temporarily, the yield is a little lower. However, the intermediate corporate, the yield is now 3.9. So we're almost to 4. And that's nice. And as these yields go up, assuming that they go up, assuming that interest rates get higher and higher over the next couple of years, these things might become more palatable. Because back in 2007, 2006, even 2009, 2010, I would have short-term, intermediate-term, and long-term bonds because you never really know which way interest rates are going to go. So you want to have some exposure to everything. But when interest rates are at record lows, historic, the all-time U.S. government record lows, it's pretty clear they're not going to go down. There's nowhere much left for them to go down. Odds are more likely they're going to go up. So I'm shying away from these two intermediate bond funds. If you wanted to throw 5% maybe in the intermediate corporate, I wouldn't be opposed to that. I wouldn't fight you on that. I wouldn't get carried away. And up until now, I've always said 0. So, this is something that changes as time goes on. That specific fund, like I said, almost 4% yield in the last calendar year, ending 12/31 of 18, because I always try to use calendar or annual numbers, not because otherwise they change day to day to day. That fund did lose 2% for calendar year 2018. So there is that downside potential. And as interest rates go up, the downside potential shrinks and the upside potential with the higher yield goes up. So it becomes more likely going forward that fund will do better than what it has done. No one knows for sure, but in general terms. Long-term bonds from Vanguard. Two of the funds that I like to use is VLGSX and VLTCX. That's long-term government and long-term corporate. The long-term government, again, barely pays anything more than the short-term bonds. And this is when they call the yield curve flat. So if you can make almost 3% in a 1-year bond and you can make almost 3% in a 20-year bond, I'll take the 1-year bond every fucking time. Because when rates go up, I can buy that 4% bond. I can buy that 5% bond. Where if you own that long-term 20-year 3% bond, you're stuck and its value goes down, down, down. And so they're not only not interesting to me at this time, they were in 2010, they were in 2005. Love these things. People made a killing on these types of bonds when interest rates went down. And so you can have a situation sometimes where the economy gets soft, the Federal Reserve lowers the overnight lending rate, people borrow less money, rates fall, long-term bonds that are paying a nice rate go up. And you can make 10, 12, 15% a year in bonds. However, now with rates going up, you can get whacked pretty hard. As an example, the long-term corporate bond fund, VLTCX, previously mentioned, in the 12 months ending 12/31 of 18, lost 8%. This is something that I've been talking about for a couple of years now, and sometimes it takes longer for things to go wrong than I thought. Look at your portfolio. If you have long-term bond funds, you are at serious risk of losing serious amounts of money. If you understand that that's what you're doing, that's cool. I don't have a problem with these per se. I'm not using them because the cushion is meant to be for protection, for safety. So, and how you can know that is you want to look up almost every single mutual fund will have a 5-letter symbol, like the things that I'm reading off here. Or if it's an ETF, it'll have often a 3-letter symbol. You can go to Morningstar.com. I've talked about that before. And you look up this fund and you want to look for 2 words. One is average maturity, and the other one is a mathematical calculation called duration. And duration will show you the relationship. I don't want to say correlation. The relationship between interest rates and price fluctuation of that fund. Again, that word is duration. You should be able to easily find that on the internets. And as example, the Vanguard Long-Term Bond Fund has a duration of 17.1. So if interest rates go up 1%, you would expect that fund to have the yield of 3%, but then go down in value 17%. So if interest rates go up 1 percentage point, that fund could lose 14% net. That's a big problem if you thought that fund was there to protect you. So going on. So all the intermediates and all the long terms, I have currently nothing, 0%. Again, with the one exception, intermediate corporate, if you want to do 5% in that, okay, I won't fight you for it. Next thing we have here is the Vanguard Total Bond Fund, VBTLX. I currently do not use that if your portfolio is large enough to avoid it. It's not bad. It's just not optimal. It lacks some of the control and the granularity that I like to have with an investment portfolio. But if you only have maybe $100,000 and you only want to put $10,000 in bonds, you can't buy the 5 or 6 funds that I'm going to talk about recommending today. You might just do this one, and you won't get as good, as wonderful of results, but it's going to be pretty close, and it's easy. It's really easy, just 10,000, bam. The difference is so small that it might not be worth the effort to eke out these improvements. And that fund currently has a 3.12% yield, so slightly over 3. In the last 12 months, again, ending December 31st, it had a loss of 0.03%. So not awful, but not impressive. All right, we've got a few more bond funds here to go over real quick. Ginnie Mae's, GNMA, Ginnie Mae's. These are tied to, linked to, associated with housing loans. They are sensitive to interest rate increases, but not as much. So the fund for that currently, and all of these are Admiral shares, by the way. I forgot to mention that earlier. This is VFIJX. That is the Vanguard Ginnie Mae Fund. Current yield 3.3. Last year made 1%. In the really long run, since 1980, this fund has had an average return of 7%. So again, it's a way where you can make money in relatively conservative investment, and it might make money differently than other bond funds over different time frames. A little more risky again. The Ginnie Mae, maybe 10 to 20% of your bond portfolio, something like that. Again, this is all kind of squishy, and it depends on you. The next fund is the Total International Bond Fund, VTABX. VTABX. The yield is only 1%, so it's very low. A lot of really well-established international countries have low interest rates right now, even lower than the United States. So it's under 1% yield. However, it's done better over the last couple of years. It made 3% last year total return, but that's something that 5%. 5% of your portfolio, no more. Really, no more. Matter of fact, this and the next two, 5% of your total portfolio, maybe 5 to 7% of your bond portfolio, but I'm just not feeling it. The next one is emerging market bonds. This is also international, but it's smaller countries, maybe less established. Chile, South Africa, Indonesia. Again, more volatile, but its current yield is 4.8%, 4.9, almost 5. The letters on that are VGAVX. And over the long run, that fund might make 4 or 5%, but in the last 12 months, it lost 3.5%. The last fund is high yield domestic U.S. bonds, also called junk bonds. The Admiral share class of that mutual fund is VWEAX, and it's also 5% or less of your total portfolio, maybe 5, 8, no more than 10. Definitely no more than 10 of your bond portfolio. So those last three, total international, emerging markets, and high yield, no more than 10 of your bond portfolio, and definitely no more than 5 of your total portfolio. They might pop. You can have a year where one of those might make 10 or 15%. And if they happen to go up 10 or 15% in a year where the stock market, U.S. stock market is down, international stock markets are down, all the other bonds made 1 or 2 or 3%, and one of these bond funds just crazily made 10, that'd be a great place to take money out of. So that's why you have all these different bond funds. So hopefully that helped with some general ideas, funds that you could use. And again, if that all went too fast, all the call letters, send me an email. I'll try to copy a list of these call letters, the symbol names, symbol numbers, symbol letters, and a short description of the fund if that's something you want. Again, that's Phil at Polaris Financial Planning. And that wraps up our Investing Skeptically segment for today.
Jesus had a tough life. Boy, I read about that guy. Jesus is the only guy that ever came back from the dead that didn't scare the fuck out of everybody, man. He's the only guy that ever crawled out of a grave where people didn't go, oh, I just saw some fucker crawl out of this grave. Jesus comes back. He doesn't get any pressure. No static. Nobody's upset. He climbs out. He's walking around. Nobody's upset. They can eat with him and everything. You know? It's like, isn't that guy dead? Yeah, but he's real stubborn, man. He won't accept it. Pass the butter. What are they staring at? Yeah, I read it, folks. I read that book. He's on the cross. 30, 40 Christians standing around going, it's a shame that he has to die. And Jesus is going, well, maybe I wouldn't have to. Somebody get a ladder and a pair of pliers. I don't know if Jesus has actually spoken in an audible voice to anybody in about 2,000 years, folks. I think his last words may have been, oh, not the other one. Oh, you jerk. Oh. It may have been his last words. I'm not sure. Yeah, people say, you think Jesus is coming back? Sure. What's it been, 2,000 years? Boy, I sure don't want to dampen anybody's optimism here. It's only 2,000 fucking years. Yeah, he's coming back. He's going to do game shows. We're going to go, Jesus, this is your life. Remember this noise? All right, don't tell me. Give me a second. He's up in heaven right now. They're going, why don't you go back down to earth? Be a symbol of peace and love to the world. Help. And he's going, yeah, sure. Help, huh? Yeah, I'd like to help. Tell him I'll be there as soon as I can play the piano again. Thanks a lot. I mean, the only savior that can use his hand is a fucking whistle.
The Phil Ferguson Show is for educational purposes only. Nothing said on the show should be interpreted as personalized investment advice. Your investment should be based on your situation, and you should consult with your financial advisor before taking any action. The show may contain ads. These ads are placed into the show by the hosting company after I finish recording and editing. I have little control over the content of the ads, and you should not assume that I support their products or claims. If you choose to support the show via the new Patreon page, that support does not create an advisor-client relationship. All right, everybody, welcome back. Next up with me, I have Monica Miller, and she is, what is it, Monica, the senior attorney for American Humanists?
That's right, senior counsel for the American Humanist Association.
Senior counsel, all right. We don't want to have attorneys, we have counsels. And you recently did something very cool. You got to go to the Supreme Court.
That's right. I argued before the Supreme Court for our case challenging the Bladensburg Cross.
And before we get into the current details, let's go in our way back machine, because this shit started like what, in 2014? That's
correct.
Can you tell me what happened in 2014 to make this start rolling?
Sure. So there are several citizens that encountered in their community a 40-foot Latin cross, a concrete cross, standing in the center of one of the busiest intersections in Prince George's County, Maryland. So they let us know about it. We did a little bit of our background work. Turns out it definitely was government property. And so our standard approach is always to draft and send a letter to the government entity that's offending the Constitution to sort of give them a chance to, figure this out before going to court. So we sent the letter. We said, look, there's this giant Christian edifice on your property. It can't be there. Here are your options. You can transfer it to private land, blah, 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 blah. They decided that they would rather go to court. So we We sued them along with the 3 individuals, and again, back in 2014, kind of a different legal landscape than we have today in terms of the Supreme Court makeup.
Right.
But we did end up winning in the Fourth Circuit Court of Appeals. And that was in 2016.
Now, I thought I read, and I'm flipping through these dozen open tabs that I have, and I can't find where I saw it. Did this originally exist on private land, and it moved, or did the land change ownership?
Yeah, so that's it's a frustrating factual claim made by the opponents that I continue to have to sort of set the record straight. But no, it was actually put up on land that was owned by the town of Bladensburg in the 1920s. It was approved by the town of Bladensburg commissioners. In fact, there's amicus briefs from the government in this case confirming that the town of Bladensburg picked out the best spot for the cross. So this was unequivocally the government's monument. We even have the deed saying it's the government's monument and saying that this is a fitting tribute for our boys, referring to the some soldiers that died in World War I. So this was always a government monument. The only difference was, the only thing that happened was that after it was in its cruciform and put up on the town's property, the funders of it ran out of money because they were in competition with a secular war memorial that was a lot more popular. So in order to finish it became an eyesore. And in order to finish it, the local Legion post agreed to take over and finish the cost. So the town transferred the care of the the care of the cross to the Legion for its completion, but it didn't really legally deed the land. As far as we're concerned, we haven't seen anything from the government that says that the land itself was actually deeded, as opposed to this sort of quasi care, sort of perpetual care sort of notion. In fact, the town put a residual clause in it saying, or a reversionary clause that said that if the local post goes out of existence, the cross and the land comes right back to the government.
So it seems pretty clear that some people, politicians involved, record keeping, that everyone knew that not only was this a religious monument, but it was in direct competition with a secular monument.
That's right. And it's it's very interesting because they said an appropriate war memorial was placed, and this is the government's document. They refer to the appropriate war memorial that was placed at the courthouse at the same time that the cross was being put up, and that citizens, feeling that they've already spent, donated money for the appropriate war memorial, didn't see fit to put up, to give money to this, what they call back then a Calvary cross. Calvary meaning a direct reference to the crucifixion of Jesus Christ. So, it's quite interesting that even back then the citizens seemed to be objecting at least to the religious nature of it, or at least didn't see it as an appropriate war memorial relative to the one that was secular and didn't have a religious symbol attached to it.
Sure. So at that time, there's documents that people considered it a religious symbol, but recently, I'm sure people now accept it as a generic, non-denominational thing. I mean, there aren't services or Easter celebrations at the cross, are there?
There's not Easter services. They do have annual events with prayers, but more to the point, and I made this notion in the oral argument, is that you don't need religious services at a Latin cross to tell you that this is a Christian symbol. There's no evidence in any expert report. There's no reason to conclude that a Latin cross can somehow be stripped of its Christian and distinctly Christian meaning. I've read cases, about the Ten Commandments and how they're sort of embraced by Judaism, Islam, and Christianity, and they sort of can be, at least according to the Supreme Court, stripped of their religious meaning. But many Christian groups filed amicus briefs in support of our position, saying it's deeply offensive to even suggest that the Latin cross can convey some sort of secular, non-religious meaning. That's, the Fourth Circuit Court below that ruled in our favor said the same thing. That's deeply offensive to Christians to even make that argument. Obviously, the Latin cross is a religious symbol. You don't need special words to tell us that. You don't need events to tell us that. It is a large Latin cross.
So I want to make sure I'm clear for the listeners. So I will ask knowingly, are you saying that somebody is saying that this ginormous Calvary/Latin cross is not a Christian symbol? Is that one of their counter arguments?
In fact, it is. They don't come out and say it is not a Christian symbol, but what they say is that it is in this context, it is a benign, secular, non-religious symbol that honors everyone, atheists, Muslims, Jews included. So basically, yes, they are saying that a Latin cross is a symbol for atheism, is a symbol for Islam, is a symbol for Judaism, and they base that on nothing.
Yeah, they base that on pulling something out of their ass, in my language, not yours, I'm sure. But okay, so I mean, what else have they said that makes this even arguable?
Right. So that was the argument I wasn't quite expecting, because I think it's just sort of preposterous to claim. The other arguments, I mean, I always say this, but there's no principled way to rule against us here. And we know that is the angle, because of the makeup of the court, that we're likely to get a ruling against us, but it's hard to fathom what that looks like. It might be based off of history, or really not even history, but the age of the cross, literally, like it's old, which, as I said in the oral argument, that doesn't really make sense because it's actively used every year by the town. They hold annual Veterans Day ceremonies there. They hold annual 4th of July ceremonies at the base of the cross. So year after year, the town is saying, this is our war memorial. This is how we are going to honor our veterans. And of course, not all veterans are honored by a Latin cross. So it's not like you can say this is some sort of artifact that's being preserved in a museum and people look at it sort of as an objective, non-government being the mouthpiece. This is the government every year saying this is our monument. So that's the part I have a problem with history, but that is one of the arguments we've seen, that it's old, that there should be some sort of, I guess you could say, grandfathering of old structures. But that doesn't really even square away with the remedy we're seeking. I mean, we're saying you don't even have to tear this down. You can leave it even exactly where it is. We don't think that that's the best idea, but we'd rather it be transferred to private property, but, where its history could still be preserved. So I don't know. It's really hard to, they've made a couple arguments here and there. The other argument is just to overrule the precedent, because the precedent doesn't support the cross. The American Legion's argument is just, well, get rid of separation of church and state, basically. I mean, that's their approach. So that's kind of where you find this, is either you overrule the precedent, all of the precedent, 70 years of Supreme Court precedent, that would basically find this unconstitutional, or you create an arbitrary line for something that's either old or that's World War I related. So yeah, those are the options. Or you just go off the fiction that this is not a Christian symbol. Those are really the three options. Now,
I want to get into the idea of leaving it there, but before I do, I want to make sure I have this right, that according to the AmericanHumanists.org website, it says that the government, the taxpayers, have already spent $117,000 in maintenance, and they're proposing to spend another $100,000 of citizens' money to maintain this cross. Is that right?
Yes, and actually it's going to be a lot more than that. So the $100,000 they recently set aside was the amount that they thought would be necessary to repair it, because it's falling apart. But actually they sent out sort of requests for proposals to contractors. All of the requests came back about $200,000, $300,000. This is going to cost a lot of money to repair, and a lot of those same experts that they commissioned told the commission that if they leave the cross where it stands, it will continue to fall apart, and that repairs might actually accelerate the deterioration of the cross due to like the sort of complications with the atmospheric pollutants and stuff. So we're looking at, them potentially just pouring tons of taxpayer dollars into this exclusively Christian monument almost for nothing. If it falls apart, then it's just like they've wasted all this money, and there's obviously higher priority projects in Bladensburg that don't involve a crumbling Christian symbol.
Absolutely. And you did briefly mention that one of the possible solutions might include the cross staying where it is. How would that work out?
Well, like I said, it's not our preferred remedy, because we don't think it resolves completely the problem with the appearance of government endorsement. But the Supreme Court did sanction that kind of remedy in a case involving a cross in the Mojave Desert. They said that, that cross was different because there wasn't any government funding of it. It was put up by private citizens without the government's knowledge or awareness. And so it sat in the middle of the desert where it was seen by more rattlesnakes than humans. So a transfer of that nature made sense, because they said, in this part of the country, the lines between public and private land are often blurred. People passing it can reasonably understand this is now private. It was kind of always private. It just happened to be on government land. That's not the case in our situation. So a transfer would really have to strongly negate and undo some of the government imprimatur. Obviously, they can't give back the 100,000, 117,000 they've already spent on it. But if they sell it to the highest bidder, they might be able to recuperate some of that. We need giant signs, saying this is private land. But, like I said, I don't think that's what the Christians, those that want the cross to last, shouldn't want that to be the option. I think they should want it to be transferred to private property where the government's own experts have said it would have a better chance of surviving.
Well, it's just dumbfounding, I think, that people would make the argument, and I know they've done this for years, in court, the argument that the cross is not a Christian symbol. But, of course, in the real world, around people's necks, in the front of the church, the cross is the symbol for Christianity, to imply that it is appropriate for Jews and Muslims and Hindus and non-believers, I think is laughable. And someone making that argument, I would be tempted to throw them out of my courtroom. But I'm not a judge.
Yeah, well, it's interesting you say that because it kind of happened in the Fourth Circuit Court of Appeals when they made that argument. And that's why I was kind of surprised to see them continue to make that argument in the Supreme Court, because there's nothing that says you have to, you can't go bring up totally different theories, but you can sort of switch your theory without making, a dramatic change in how you're going about things. But for them to continue to argue to the Supreme Court after basically being laughed at in the Fourth Circuit about this, they were talking to a judge who had already kind of alluded to being Christian when I was arguing. Because he said his thing to me was like, oh, why did you bring this case? Like, now you're putting me in this awful position, like, as a Christian. He was kind of saying that to me, like, I don't want to rule against this cross.
Right.
But and I'm like, oh gosh, like, this is not good for me. But then they get up and they start telling him their argument, which is that this is not a Christian symbol. It's just a benign World War I symbol. And he starts like, are you kidding me? He's like, no, it's not. It's a Christian symbol. It's my Christian symbol. And I was like, I think they just lost their case. So yeah, they almost did get laughed at. And it is kind of a laughable argument.
So the court has heard everything and everyone's had their say. Is that where we're at now?
Yes, that's where we're at. We're just waiting for the ruling. And
when is that supposed to happen? Or does the Supreme Court just roll those out whenever they feel like it?
My understanding is early summer. I don't know, if they would wait till the next term, but I think it would be sometime in the summer.
So there's the possibility they could say it's got to move. Can this cross be moved? It's a big piece of concrete, right? 40-foot high piece of concrete with rebar or something. Can that even actually move and survive?
So the government did testify that they were able to move old historic houses. And I think a house is a lot more intricate than a cross. The other thing is that there was 2 other World War I monuments that had been in the middle of intersections, both of which were very heavy. They were like granite, marble, large, maybe not 40 feet, but they were in the 20 feet range, but they were the kind of heavier bronze and granite monuments that the government successfully moved to private land, no problem. They weren't even religious. I think they were just moved because they were in the middle of intersections and they realized that's not a good place for a monument. Same here. I don't know why they didn't move out this one in that sort of grouping. It was in the 1930s and 50s that the 2 were moved. So yeah, of course it would be difficult. And Justice Sotomayor in the argument made in my argument actually made a good point to say that, okay, we know the cross is already falling apart. Why not just she wasn't really asking me this. She was really just saying it to express her opinion, but she was like, why not, it just makes sense to move it to the private property and then fix it. It might get a little more banged up along the way, but you're already planning to spend all this money fixing it. Why not just wait till it gets to the private land and let it crumble a little bit more in transit? And I was like, I'm fine with that.
It makes sense for it to be on private land. And if a whole bunch of people want to have what I consider a stupid eyesore on their private land and spend hundreds of thousands of dollars of fixing it, knock yourselves out,
right?
But leave me the fuck out of it.
Exactly. I mean, I think when people find out how much money, especially in a town like Bladensburg that has a lot of needs, it's kind of, there's parts of it that are kind of torn down. I mean, uh, uh, Nina Totenberg in her article for NPR said this area and this cross is just more grungy than grand. She was very unimpressed by just the falling apart nature of the whole kind of area. And so I think it's just, when you're talking about spending $100,000 on this crumbling cross, when you could spend that rebuilding, a playground for kids or cleaning up, a park. I mean, there's just so many other things you can do with that $100,000 that would be really a productive use of the money for the town that wouldn't include this eyesore. It's dangerous. I mean, even if, like I said, even if they make the repairs, it might not fix it. And so you're going to continue to have chunks of gravel and concrete falling down where there are passing cars, where people want to come and observe and look at the cross. They risk having a giant chunk of concrete fall on them. I mean, that's the situation right now. There's chunks falling off.
Yeah, can't this be fixed with thoughts and prayers?
Right, exactly.
That always seems to work.
Right.
What else is the American Humanist Association doing, legally speaking?
Sure. So we have a kind of pending cases across the board. So one of my other cases that is scheduled for argument in the Ninth Circuit Court of Appeals involves a humanist inmate in a Nevada prison who has been denied the ability to meet in a humanist group and identify as a humanist, where the prison recognizes, like Wicca and different forms of these sort of pagan religions. They recognize, of course, Christianity and Islam. So we're just saying humanists have the same right to meet in groups as these other faiths. I mean, you don't have to call it a religion to say that they're entitled under the First Amendment to equal treatment in this context. We have a case involving legislative prayers in Carroll County, Maryland. It's a situation where the town commissioners have been delivering the prayers, whereas the Supreme Court in town of Greece said you could have citizen-led prayers when they're on a non-discriminatory and neutral basis, but they kind of implicitly, almost actually, I'd say explicitly said that you can't have the government leading and directing those prayers, and that's what we have here. So those are my two most active cases right now. We also have another cross case that came out of Florida that's currently pending in the Supreme Court. We think that they will just hold on to that and maybe not rule on it until they decide Bladensburg. And so we have a couple other ones, like a school prayer case and a case involving an Arkansas Ten Commandments monument, a police prayer vigil. So we have sort of cases in different sections that don't involve monuments.
Yeah. Now, I really like one of the slogans that you guys have come up with in relationship to the Bladensburg Cross. And what is that slogan?
Honor them all.
I like that. Because you're not saying Christians can't be honored.
No.
You're saying, hey, come on. It's not just one religion. Everybody should be recognized and honored. Exactly.
And I think that, it's everyone, I think, agrees, and I said this in the argument, but I think everyone agrees that the Latin Cross doesn't represent everyone. I think that, that's the government's position. It's not even the American Legion's position. It's just the government's position. But yeah, of course, the Latin Cross doesn't honor them all. We're not saying dishonor Christians. We're saying find a symbol, kind of like the one in the courthouse that that the cross was outcompeted with for funding. It's a doughboy. The doughboy was the most common World War I monument, the most appropriate World War I monument, and it's a sculpture of a man wearing a World War I uniform. You've seen them probably in other places. They're typically bronze, and they have the doughboy uniform, so they're very symbolic of World War I. But yeah, there's obviously many, many appropriate ways to honor our war veterans. It does not include a large 40-foot Latin cross.
Now, I know American Humanists generally have an annual conference. Do you have details about that? I know it's not your part of the organization, but do you know what's going on?
I do know what's going on. I don't have the details in front of me. And with the case, my brain shoved out certain information.
I knew I was kind of giving you something that might not be your expertise, but
but I can give you the gist of this year's conference because it is kind of different. Normally, we hold our conferences in one location, And we'll sometimes post videos after the fact, but this year we're doing something different. We're actually going to be in several locations, and we will be doing sort of live video streaming and an ability for people to come to a location that's closest to them. And I don't know how we're working out all the kinks in terms of like timing and East Coast and West Coast timing and that stuff, but I do know that we're definitely experimenting with this new approach by having it these sort of satellite locations where people can come either to the local location or just tune in virtually.
Yeah, what I'll do is when we're not in the middle of an interview, I'll look it up and tell all the listeners when and where so they can go check that out, because it is, like you said, it's something different.
Yeah.
And fingers crossed that everyone loves it, but sometimes different, you take a risk. So we'll find out.
Yeah, it does make me nervous. Yeah, it makes me a little nervous just with all the technology components to it. And knowing, we have a great staff, but we are kind of like, I wouldn't say understaffed, but it's a big endeavor to pull off something that unique. But I'm confident in our employees that we'll be able to pull it off. It's just it's exciting to try something new, but it's also very scary to try something new.
I understand. Now, if you don't mind, just for a few minutes, let's talk about you. Were you always an atheist? Did you grow up in a religious household? What is your backstory?
Sure. I went to Catholic school for 10 years, K through 8, but my family's not Catholic. It's the local school. It was, kind of progressive Catholic. In fact, I kind of joke, but there's public schools in this country that I'm now aware of as an adult that I think are more religious than my Catholic school.
Yeah.
That being said, growing up, I think my parents told me I was Episcopalian or something, but I think they just wanted to say something for purposes of, because every time we were at a mass, you had to, if you were a non-Catholic kid, you had to do something different with your hands. You had to cross them over your heart rather than get the cracker. So I think sometimes they would ask me what my religion was, and I didn't really have an answer. So they were like, "You're Episcopalian." Okay. But then by the time, my parents never said they were anything but Christian, but they didn't actually practice. So I think now that I'm an adult, it's pretty clear to me that they're more in my mom's more in the, spiritual camp, I think, but they're not practicing any religion. I think they just took the Catholic school approach because it was a good school. And then by the time I was in high school, I took a course at the local community college just for kind of extra credit in world religions, because I really hadn't exposed myself to different religions. I was just familiar with the Catholic faith, and that was not for me. And then that was really what solidified the atheism. So it was all these religions have the same strength of their claim that theirs is the true religion.
Right.
And it underscored the man-made nature of it, that they're just, the accident of birth. Oh, you're born in this country and that's your religion. So that really kind of solidified that I'm definitely an atheist. I don't know if I had that word back then. I might have just not religious. It wasn't a word I was that familiar with. I think in high school I might have thought it meant anarchist because you'd see those A's.
Yes.
And so then by the time I was in college is when it was more apparent. And then, I've always wanted to do animal rights, and I actually have another job in that field. But when I was at an undergrad, sort of looking at law schools to go the animal rights path, I took a course in sociology of secularism taught by Phil Zuckerman, and a lot of the coursework was on, kind of not pro-atheism, but, atheism's always sort of been not anti, but I didn't realize there was a movement, a secular movement, this sort of need to affirmatively protect separation of church and state, to affirmatively, promote science and rational thinking. So that kind of started me on that trajectory of maybe I should, while I'm in law school, sort of explore the separation of church and state angle. And then, of course, when I was there, I got really into it. I started my own secular law student club and brought in some First Amendment speakers. So I just ended up kind of on both tracks with First Amendment and animal rights.
I like it. Now, are there any places you're going to give talks coming up? Do you know of?
Off the top of my head right now, no. I might be speaking at the AHA's conference. I might also be speaking at the Florida Humanist Conference. I don't have the full title of their group yet, but I think that's in November. I'm just checking my calendar. So those are the two that might be coming up.
Very good.
Yeah.
as we get to the point where we're going to wrap up, is there anything about you or AHA or the Cross that you want to add in?
Let's see. I think I covered everything.
Excellent. Well, I thank you for being on the show, and I'm so excited that you got to go to the Supreme Court, and fingers crossed that they give a judicially prudent response and don't split some weird hairs and create a gap. What do they call it? The camel's nose in the tent kind of thing for more crosses to stay or be put up.
Yep, agreed.
Well, Monica Miller, thank you so much. I appreciate you being on the Phil Ferguson Show.
Yep, thanks for having me.
You're listening to the Phil Ferguson Show.
Thank you so much for listening. This wraps up the show. I'm going to keep the ending segment here nice and short because I got to go start packing. Like I said, I'm going to take a couple of trips, but I'll be back. We'll have some more shows. We'll have some more fun. In the meantime, if you have questions, show ideas, interview ideas, whatever, you may email me, phil@polarisfinancialplanning.com. I hope to see you somewhere soon for sure. I will be in Cincinnati at the end of April for the American Atheist Conference. If you see me there, please feel free to come by and say hello. Until then, ciao.